Good evening. How's this? Okay. Hi and welcome. Good evening. Nice to see you all here. Thanks for coming. My name is Barbara Altman. I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center, sponsor of tonight's event. I'm going to do a quick introduction and then we'll get to our main speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce Denis Hayes, a man with so many accomplishments and accolades that it's hard to know how to abbreviate them to give you an overview. Before we get to the introduction proper, I wanted to give you a little bit of information. A quick word first about the lectureship that Denis Hayes holds with us here today. It is the Humanities Center Clark Lecture for 2009-2010. The Clark Lectureship was established in 1994 with a generous gift from the Bowerman family, of whom we have several members here today. The goal of the lectureship is, to quote, to promote public discussion on the natural sciences, the history of Oregon, and the interface between science and social and cultural affairs, as exemplified by Thomas Condon, legendary frontier missionary, geologist, paleontologist, and founding member of the UO anthropology faculty. The lectureship is named after former UO President Robert D. Clark, who wrote a biography of Thomas Condon entitled The Odyssey of Thomas Condon, and I think Clark would have approved of this particular guest as eminently worthy of his legacy, as you will see. Before going on, I would also like to acknowledge our very generous co-sponsors. They are the Morse Center for Law and Politics and the Clark Honors College, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, on which we heartily congratulate them. Mr. Hayes spent the afternoon with students at the Clark Honors College, a wonderful opportunity for the coming generation of activists to learn from one of the masters. I also want to acknowledge the Humanities Center staff, without whom this kind of event simply doesn't happen. My thanks, therefore, to our Associate Director, Julia Hayden, and much appreciation to Melissa Gustafson for all the logistical work, to Peg Gearhart for the publicity, and for being producer for our TV interview that you can see in about 2 weeks, and to Lindsay Hendrickson and to Ty, always ready to back us up and who are helping here tonight, and other steadfast volunteers who keep us up and running. One last practical matter. We anticipate that many people will want to ask questions of Mr. Hayes during the question and answer following his lecture. In order to accommodate as many people as possible, and so that all questions are captured on the recording of the event, we'd like to ask you to do the following. If you have a question, please come to the mic in the aisle. There's 2 of them. If you cannot do so, we're happy to bring you a cordless mic. When you have the floor, we ask that you ask a question rather than make a statement, and that you limit your question to a minute or so. I'll ask you to finish if you run much over that limit. Thanks for your cooperation with this system. It keeps the discussion flowing and it allows a maximum number of people to join in. And now, what you've been waiting for, a real introduction. Denis Hayes has been called a practical visionary, and that is the role he plays as the president and CEO of the Bullitt Foundation, which was founded in 1952 by Seattle businesswoman Dorothy Bullitt. Hayes became president in 1992. To quote from their website, the Bullitt Foundation works on the principle that, quote, sustainable human institutions and enterprises will be based on the same ecological principles that govern all ecosystems, unquote. Their work is concentrated geographically in the Pacific Northwest. Another essential fact to mention is that Hayes was the coordinator of the first Earth Day held in 1970, a role through which he rose to prominence as an activist. He continued to expand Earth Day, organizing anniversary events in 1990 and in 2000, to the extent that now more than 180 nations participate. Earth Day has become the world's most widely observed secular holiday. In other roles, Hayes directed the Federal National Renewable Energy Laboratory during the Carter administration. He has been a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a senior fellow at the World Watch Institute, an adjunct professor of engineering at Stanford University, and a Silicon Valley lawyer. His awards and honors are numerous. He's been given the National Jefferson Medal for Outstanding Public Service, as well as the highest awards bestowed by the Sierra Club, the National Wildlife Federation, the National Resources Council of America, and the Commonwealth Club, among many others. He also serves on many governing boards, including those of Stanford University, the World Resources Institute, the Federation of American Scientists, the Energy Foundation, Children Now, Greenpeace, and the Environmental Grantmakers Association. He continues to chair the board of the International Earth Day Network. The title of tonight's talk, which will last between 45 minutes and an hour, or between 30 and 45, we'll see, is Prosperity Incompatible with Posterity? Please help me welcome Denis Hayes.
Is this working if I speak like this? Can you hear me? Well, thank you very much, Barbara, for that introduction. Sadly inadequate, though it obviously was. When somebody goes on and actually pulls out a computer program to read your sort of biographical sketch, you realize you're in trouble. It's one of those things that in the old saw my father would have loved and my mother would have believed. We had dinner tonight with the Bowermans in an extraordinarily nice room with Oregon wines literally filling the walls on both sides. And for reasons that have nothing to do with my talk and that I'm not entirely sure why I'm bringing it up, I was sitting there constantly reminded of a thing that my father used to say when he was sort of in the sauce and my mother was starting to get on him a little bit about that. And he would say, "I would much rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy." That's a good line. My mother's cherished belief is that alcohol was God's way of making sure that the Irish didn't take over the world. I'm here tonight following in the footsteps of a really distinguished bunch of speakers, and I'm reasonably intimidated by it and put a fair amount of thought into figuring out what I wanted to say. And because this has to do with the humanities, I'm going to begin with a few lines from Alexander Pope. He's speaking of this transcendent being who sees with equal eye as God of all, a hero perish or a sparrow fall, atoms or systems into ruins hurled, and now a bubble burst, and now a world. Tonight, I'm going to be talking a bit about financial bubbles and then in an almost incomprehensibly big ecological bubble that I believe underlies them and that has the real prospect of causing the world to burst. That probably does not sound like a fun way to spend the evening. And I'm going to spend most of the talk actually discussing practical things that we can do to avoid it. So during the bleak portion, please keep in mind that trend is not necessarily the same as destiny, but it's worth spending some time on the trends. For several hundred years, Western economies have experienced occasional bubbles of irrational exuberance. These bubbles are always temporary, and they always end badly. Nicholas Taleb has famously described the bad endings as black swans, phenomena that are considered so extremely improbable that they are essentially ignored until they happen. And in the end, economic bubbles always collapse, flushing a huge amount of wealth down the toilet. Perhaps the most famous bubble of all time was in the 16th century Tulip Mania in the Netherlands. Tulips were introduced in Holland in 1593, and they immediately became a sensation among the rich. Eventually, houses, ultimately even full-blown businesses, were traded for a single rare tulip bulb. A futures market developed to trade tulips that had not yet been bred. And then, some 40 years later, in 1637, at a random gathering of tulip merchants, the sellers failed to get the usual inflated prices for the next wave of bulbs. And the word spread across the land like lightning. The market crashed overnight. Thousands of Dutch merchants, including the nation's leading power brokers, went bankrupt as people came to realize instantly that there had been a total disconnect between prices and any kind of rational basis of value. There was the South Sea bubble, which involved wildly kited stock prices. The company used these vastly inflated stock prices to acquire half of the debt of England. That's to say half of the national debt on which they would then have a draw upon tax revenues on into perpetuity. It was not easy to do this. They were bidding against the Bank of England, but they bribed not just the king's favorite mistress, but the king's favorite two mistresses. And there were a number of other kinds of shenanigans that might have actually even embarrassed John Edwards that were involved in making this whole thing happen. And in the end, they acquired it. And eventually, this too-big-to-fail precursor to AIG collapsed in turn because, once again, people realized that stock had nothing behind it to justify those extraordinary prices. And this, in turn, led to the collapse of the London stock market in 1720 and the first approximation of what we came later to experience as the Great Depression. The whole nation simply went under for a while. Bubbles, of course, are not limited to ancient history. They happen whenever people close their eyes to reality. I'd argue that in the mid-1980s, we suffered one in the Soviet Union. It was at that time one of the era's superpowers, and it splintered with astonishing speed into numerous nations, even the strongest of which, Russia, now has basically a third world economy. The core problem in the USSR was that prices were not allowed to reflect reality. Economic success, even in a planned economy, requires good information and a Darwinian culling of uncompetitive enterprises, but Soviet prices were set by bureaucrats and politicians, and they often bore no relationship at all to supply and demand. They manufactured millions and millions of items that nobody wanted and failed to grow the food, for example, that everyone needed. And eventually, all of this disconnect between what the state is supposed to provide for people and what it actually did provide caused it to lose its legitimacy in the eyes of its public, and ultimately it crashed. It had lots of other factors feeding into it, but that, I think, was the biggest. Conventional bubbles, such as those we've had in America, the real estate boom that preceded the Panic of 1837, which ultimately closed 90% of all factories on the East Coast, the Roaring '20s, which crashed into the Great Depression, our little millennial .com bubble, were all examples of robust optimism that was detached from reality. To believe that mouse clicks could actually be monetized, that there was a value to someone in front of their computer merely clicking their mouse but taking no action whatsoever other than that, requires a willful suspension of disbelief. I mean, it is, in effect, a tulip phenomenon. The most recent financial bubble confused securitization, I think, with alchemy. Many of the most gifted mathematicians in the securities industry came to believe that a complex algorithm could convert toxic acids into risk-free gold. They sold slices of subprime interest-free balloon payment mortgages as AAA-rated debt. And huge institutions larded their balance sheets with these collateralized debt obligations and other lucrative derivatives, the most complicated of which were literally designed by astrophysicists. They appeared to the auditors to be nearly risk-free, but their actual risk was inherently unknowable because of the complex machinations that lay behind them. And without knowing the risk of non-payment, it was impossible to determine the actual value of the assets. And of course, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of assets. Ultimately, these assets came to be viewed as likely to be so worthless that nobody would buy them at any price. This led to a worldwide liquidity crisis, a seized-up financial system, a plummeting global stock market, flatlining consumer confidence, and skyrocketing unemployment. And this, of course, is not the 17th century. This is last year. The collapse, the black swan, was so stunning that we still have difficulty comprehending it. Through the first week of March last year, the Standard & Poor's 500 had declined 56% from its 207 peak. NASDAQ was down 73%. And at the heart of it all, the KBW Bank Index dropped 85% from peak to trough. Yet, bad as it was, this crisis appears now to be ending. And there are going to be shocks to come, probably some having to do with credit card debt. There are some great commercial lending weaknesses that are still out there. But illiquidity is not an irreversible condition. And at some point, coordinated global fiscal policies, inflationary monetary policies, and Hopefully, a reassertion of strong governmental oversight of the financial sector and of other key industries will bring the global economy back to normalcy. That sounds like good news. That's what it's all about. That's why we, this year, will acquire another $1.5 trillion of debt. And the basic theme of my talk here tonight is that returning to normalcy is mostly bad news. Returning to normalcy is missing an opportunity for really important change. And in the clearest example of that, if you're really caring about building a better world, you do not restrict all of your payments to shovel-ready projects. You put some of that into money into something that is going to transform the society in ways other than simply distributing purchasing power to people to fill potholes. Lurking behind the economic bubble, in my view, is an ecological bubble that is vastly more significant, the principal driver of which is what we call normalcy. Ecosystems tend toward equilibrium. When anything gets out of balance, natural processes pull it back into a sustainable condition. For example, shifting environmental conditions, like an unusually rainy period, frequently permit animals to exceed their long-term carrying capacity. It produces a ladybug bubble, or an elk bubble, and that bubble is inevitably followed by a collapse. The animal population is reduced once again to its carrying capacity, typically by predators, disease, or starvation. Humans, too, are part of nature. We experience ecological bubbles. These occur when our populations exceed the long-term carrying capacity of their domain, or when human behavior undermines the biological integrity of the environment. A gratifying amount of research has been done on human ecological collapses, and Jared Diamond has tied much of it together with his masterful book, Collapse. Unlike economic collapses, which always recover, human ecological collapses, think here of Mesopotamia, the Mayan civilization, the Vikings in Iceland, Easter Island, Amazonia, do not quickly bounce back. In fact, many don't bounce back ever. Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, of course, is the desert wastes of Iraq. Past human ecological collapses have been limited to a specific area, but economic globalization has brought with it global ecological impacts, only the most visible of which right now is climate change. There are similar things going on with the other great cycles of nature, the hydrological cycle, the nitrogen cycle. Just as global economic collapse leaves no refuge even for the nimblest investor, and there was no place to go. I run a $100 million portfolio. I was looking for something safe. Go into cash? That wouldn't do it. Go into sovereign debt? No. Go into third world debt? No. Go into large caps, small caps, venture capital, private equity. There was no place to go to that wasn't collapsing simultaneously. It was a global economic collapse, and a global ecological collapse is a similarly daunting prospect. It's a little bit like the Dust Bowl without California. There is no place to go that isn't going to be suffering it. That, I think, is what we are currently hurtling toward as a result of what we now view as economic normalcy. Throughout the global economy, prices don't reflect reality. We are liquidating our natural capital, and we are not reflecting this on our books anyplace. We've been undermining the vibrancy of ecosystem services, such as those provided by the remaining great forests, coral reefs, coastal wetlands, and utterly ignoring it in our economic decision-making. When you go out fishing, and we have now overfished every major fishery in the world, several of which are now in a state of collapse, you pay for the boat, you pay for the nets, you pay for the labor, you pay for all sorts of things. You don't pay for the fish. And yet, it's the fish that are being overfished. And if you don't have that anywhere in your account books, if you're not amortizing fish, then you don't have an industry in a few years. It would be true for any industry, but those based on natural resources are the ones where you can ignore those free goods. The error boundaries in estimating these accounting discrepancies are large. Costanza et al., in a peer-reviewed 1997 article in the journal Nature, attempted to produce some numbers. He compiled his figures from a whole bunch of peer-reviewed articles that were looking at different kinds of ecosystem services in different biomes around the world, all of them in a wide variety of journals, pulled it out, added it together with a distinguished team of colleagues, and came up with sort of a spread of what it could be. But the minimum amount that they concluded was plausible for the annual benefit that human beings get from these ignored elements in our balance sheets was $33 trillion. At the time they did their study, in that year's dollars, the gross domestic product of the planet was $18 trillion. 18 we count, 33 we don't. Einstein famously commented that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. I think there's a great deal of wisdom from that to be applied here. In this case, the stuff that we don't count when we make major investment decisions is twice as valuable as the stuff we analyze to death. The accounting behind this global ecological bubble is an open lie, tacitly ignored by everyone because, as with all bubbles, finding the truth is so difficult, and confronting the truth is so painful. Like other massive accounting frauds that move expenses off the balance sheets, ignoring externalities leads to a false, very false sense of well-being. Ignoring environmental externalities, the growth of the global economy appears to have been an absolutely spectacular success, a triumph. In real dollars, measured in today's dollars, output grew from 6 trillion in 1950 to 60 trillion in 2008. But consider what we ignore. We've used roughly half of all the conventional petroleum that we will ever extract without investing meaningfully in an energy system to replace it. In a rational world, we would be amortizing that oil, but only the Norwegians seem to be doing that, and even in Norway, only in a limited fashion. Climate change is beginning to turn the world's breadbaskets into dust bowls with much greater impacts visible on the horizon. In addition to warming the planet, CO2 is acidifying the ocean, destroying not just massive coral reefs and all of the fish that are bred there, but also destroying the small little pteropods at the very bottom of the ocean food chain. And ultimately, the disappearance of the pteropods may be far more important than the disappearance of the coral reefs. Permanent topsoil loss is impoverishing the world's long-term agricultural prospects. Virtually every aquifer on Earth is being depleted, some at alarming rates. There are some that are going down 10, 15, even 20 feet a year. You have to go down that much farther to get water, and therefore you have to pump that water that much higher to get it out, using that much more energy, and ultimately there is a bottom. The world's rainforests, the lungs of the planet, potential sources of unique new drugs and other things, are under a full-scale assault. Hormone-mimicking substances are accumulating in every food chain in the world, even the most remote, with unknown consequences. But we see these correlations with those endocrine disruptors and all sorts of things that are going on. Fish up in Puget Sound are of confused sexuality. They have both male and female sex organs, are unable to reproduce. Alligators down in Florida being born in one whole lake, all of the alligators with penises ranging from a half an inch to an inch. There are these things that go on in your endocrine cycles where if a certain very trace amount of a hormone is present, something happens. If it's not present, nothing happens. And if it comes at the wrong time, it doesn't work. These things that look like hormones that we are producing mingle into those natural systems and completely confuse the dickens out of it. And we're beginning to see this now in everything from plastics that are being used in baby bottles on through the plastic liners in every can of soup that you see. Is that a John McCain moment? No. Let me turn this off. I didn't say anything to you, but I ought to stop my own as well. Wasn't that the weirdest thing in the world when his wife called and he carries on this conversation while the entire room is waiting for him? None of these potentially huge externalities and others like mountaintop mining and nuclear proliferation and fighting a preemptive war to maintain access to the world's second largest reserves of oil is reflected in the price signals that steer the world economy. This is a classic definition of a bubble. Failing to include ecological costs in national income accounts and in corporate financial statements is every bit as misleading and even more guaranteed to produce a catastrophe as surreptitiously shifting debts to offshore corporations housed in the Cayman Islands. Costs are costs, And sooner or later, the piper has to be paid. Mother Nature does not do bailouts. Mother Nature just shows up one day and breaks your kneecaps. And the evidence suggests that that day is getting close. So, what should we do? We spent a long time building this economy. It is incredibly complicated. Fixing it is going to take time. It's going to take intelligence. It's going to take myriad discrete acts of courage. It's going to take experiments that fail as well as experiments that succeed. But we have to change a zillion things. Let me suggest a few of the more important steps I think we need to take. First, get the price right. As we've seen, determining a price for many of these negative impacts is easier said than done. But it's clear that the price is not zero, and policy instruments can be used to establish intelligent prices. One example much in the news these days. I have been arguing for many, many years for a scientifically determined cap to be set on carbon emissions each year, declining each year into the future. It should be coupled with an upstream cap and auction system for establishing a price. If you do this approach, a cap and auction, this is not cap and trade at all, where you're trading in offsets of Guatemalan forests to open up a coal-fired power plant in Pennsylvania. It is only trading the permits to bring coal into the economy or oil into the economy or any fossil fuel into the economy. This approach, the cap and auction, combines the best elements of a cap and trade system, which is the cap, with the strongest element of a carbon tax, which is a price, in an elegant, flexible system that would also boost the national savings rate. It is, in effect, a different name for a carbon tax, but if it's a tax and you have to go back to Congress every time you want to change it, we don't really know the long-term elasticities of different kinds of taxes, so you try this and you go back to Congress. If it's not working, try that. And it's a system that seems to me that although the economists, in theory, like it, it's completely impracticable in a political world. But if you have a cap that is automatically set that is national policy, that doesn't have to go back to Congress. That can be assigned to an administrative agency, and the auctions set what is in effect the price. You have to buy the permit to be able to bring the carbon into the economy. It's an elegant system that has one disadvantage, and that's that it's got essentially no support. With one big exception. Senators Maria Cantwell and Susan Collins are co-sponsoring legislation that would begin to do this. Moreover, they want to rebate most of the revenue on a per capita basis, thus making it the most progressive tax in the world, because if you have a carbon tax that is upstream, it tends to be proportional to people, actually proportional to people's consumption more than income or wealth. But consumption is pretty closely linked to income and wealth. So you're collecting more and more money from those who are relatively well-to-do, but redistributing it on a per capita basis. So if you pay relatively little because you are on the lower end of the ladder, you get the same amount back as a Rockefeller. It is a redistributive mechanism as well. That will help it in some circles. It will really hurt it in other circles, but at least it's a very clever approach to it. It's currently a non-starter politically, but I would hope, and I need to point out that it is the evening. I am, at this point, speaking as a citizen, not as the president of a philanthropy that has received favorable tax treatment that stops it from speaking out on political or legislative issues, but wholly as an individual. I would urge you to lean heavily on Oregon senators to sign on and give it some momentum. It's not a perfect bill, but it is head and shoulders better than anything else currently in play. And I think your senators are winnable. I think a bunch of senators are winnable if we have a public outpouring on it that says it's time to get serious. Does anybody here know when the National Academy of Sciences issued its first report on climate change that said, although uncertainties remain, you're not able to come, yeah, and there we are. It's a guy that went through this quiz with me earlier today from the Honors College. First report that said some uncertainties remain, but it is now sufficiently clear and convincing that it is time for the federal government to start making discrete steps to control climate change. 79. So 30 years, and nothing as yet. A plus on this bill, it's 40 pages long, and it's written in English. It's just amazing. I mean, if you look at the cap and trade legislation, both of the bills are more than 1,500 pages long, and they're utterly incomprehensible. Most of the drafting came from lobbyists who were in there concerned with protecting private interests, not the public interest. This is a page that, if you don't want to trust me, easily downloaded from the web, easily read in half an hour, and then go bust your butts to get your senators to sign on to it. Built by lobbyists. When I was young, I thought that the reason that the good guys were going to be winning was because we worked so damned hard. I mean, I was paid $4,500 a year, and on average, I worked 90 hours a week. And I just figured, we're going to cut their butts, man. We're smart, we're driven. That's not going to do it for us. The lobbyists that are there are really smart. Managing editors from the Harvard Law Review, they're working 80 hours a week for a little bit more money than we were. And they're dedicated. And you get that kind of talent. You pay them $500 an hour, and their job for 9 months is to move an apostrophe from one side of the S to the other side of the S, thus making this thing not targeted at a particular company, but a particular industry, hence being worth an enormous amount of money to somebody, and he'll get it done. It's that level of stuff that just gets buried in these huge, complex pieces of legislation that come back and bite us in the rear, time after time after time. We don't win when we're dealing in that complex world, almost ever. We win when we get the public aroused about something that is comprehensible, and they bring enough pressure upon people that no matter how much the Supreme Court gives latitude to corporations to get engaged in political activities, they still haven't given them the vote, and we can vote these guys out of office if we make it a voting issue. Incidentally, is there anybody in the room who agrees with the Supreme Court that the principal problem with American politics is that it didn't have enough corporate money in it? Next, we need to substitute craftsmanship for throughput. Much of Oxford University was built almost 800 years ago. They subsequently built the new college. That was finished 600 years ago. Today's typical building has a design expectancy of 40 to 70 years. So what happened? We created an economic system that places its highest value on consumption and applies an extremely high discount rate to accumulated wealth. Today's net current value of essentially anything 50 years from now is zero. You can't get people to do things that produce value after zero. I'm building a building that I hope is going to have a design life of 250 years, but the banks will not finance any additional expenditures that would produce a revenue stream that would be amortized over a longer period of time than 40 years from the banks. Of course we don't spend money on quality and on endurance. Of course we don't build buildings that are designed to last for hundreds and hundreds of years. You know, if you've gone through Europe and you see the old Roman roads, the aqueducts, 2,000 years ago, I mean, we've got designers as good as the Roman designers. We've got engineers as good as the Roman engineers. We've got probably superior materials available to us today. The big difference, I'm convinced in my heart, is that the Romans did not have economists. They're just forced into this set of decisions that don't make sense over the long run. This short-sighted, consumption-dominated economy is a relatively recent chapter in human history. I mean, can you imagine Franklin Roosevelt or Dwight Eisenhower suffering an attack on the dominant New York office towers and going on television the next day to urge Americans to go shopping? That wasn't how we used to respond to these things. My parents never had a credit card. They never had a mortgage. They saved for years until they could finally buy a home for $18,000 cash. They were of modest means, so they didn't buy much, but when they bought, for example, furniture, they bought the finest furniture that they could afford in the hopes of passing it on to me and my brother and my sister. They thought it would be part of our family for a long time. It's the accumulated treasure of the family. Today, people buy furniture that's made out of sawdust and glue, and it disintegrates quickly, so they have to go buy some more. In fact, it's designed to disintegrate quickly. Planned obsolescence has become an essential core of the economy. The faster the rate of throughput, the faster the wood goes from the forest to the dump, the more the global economy prospers. A little personal note. About 8 years ago, I found myself in a position where I had to do a lot of walking. And I bought myself a pair of very good walking shoes, Mephistos. They cost about 300 bucks. They're not Ferragamos, but they're really nice shoes. More expensive probably than 98% of the shoes out there. I've worn them a few times every week since, and I've resold them 5 times at a cost of about $60 a time. So I now have a total of $600 invested in these shoes, and I've had essentially 6 pairs of shoes at $100 a pair over that time. I'm wearing them right now, and as you know, Seattle rains a lot. The cracks are starting to get sufficiently big in the leather that I think they really have come to the end of the resoling process. But I think that's the way that we should be behaving. I probably ought to be deeply embarrassed by all of this. I am a one-man anti-stimulus package. But I don't want an economy that requires me to throw away perfectly good shoes because the sole's got a little thin. The primary engine of global economic growth for the last few decades has been the willingness of Americans to buy junk that they don't need with money that they don't have. I'm going to say that one more time because I think that may be the single most important thing I'm talking about tonight. The primary engine of global economic growth for the last few decades has been the willingness of Americans to buy junk that they don't need with money that they don't have. China at times had a savings rate of 18, 20, 25%. America had a savings rate that was occasionally as much as 1 and 2 and occasionally in negative territory. By pulling equity out of our houses as a nation, we were actually spending more money than we were creating. That can't go on. That's just nuts. And it certainly showed you the different kinds of responses to the economic meltdown in terms of what happened in China with its large economic surpluses, stimulating its economy in really interesting ways. A 10-year program to lace the entire country with high-speed electrified rail. We're 8 years into it, almost done already. High speed over there is 220 miles an hour, and it's all linked together. You know, if we are at peak oil, it's very difficult to figure out how you're going to fly planes. Right? I mean, there are lots of things you can do with electricity on the ground with trains and with cars and what have you. You can't really do fast electrified flight. You need liquid fuels, and they're going to be really expensive. It makes sense to get fast ground transport at 220 miles an hour. The best way to get from here to Seattle is on a train. You can't do that. We're not making any progress. We're putting in a couple of lines, we hope, over the course of the next 5 years, but our high speed is going to be about 150 to 160 miles an hour. A combination of economic globalization, uncontrolled externalities, a huge and upwardly mobile world population, the disruption of natural cycles, now appears to be teeing up the mother of all ecological collapses. We can't tolerably adapt to it, so we have to find ways to avoid it. The vast majority of current economic policies, in support of which we are currently mortgaging our future, likely tripling our national debt before we're through it, are designed to perpetuate the same preference for debt-driven consumption that is imperiling our destiny. Is there anything we can do about this other than give speeches urging people to buy less, to buy quality? Well, again, I've got an idea that I think makes a great deal of sense, and once again, it has that same huge problem attached to it that it has no support from anybody with any power. But let me pitch it anyway. We ought to change from a progressive income tax with lots and lots and lots of loopholes and a tax code that is as incomprehensible as anything that emerges from Capitol Hill to a progressive consumption tax. Taxpayers would report their income, as they do at present, and their savings, much as we now document retirement accounts. So, in rough terms, a family's total assets at the beginning of the year plus its income for the year minus its assets at the end of the year equals its consumption. How much do you have? How much do you earn? How much do you have at the end of the year? And whatever the difference is what you consumed. That minus a standard deduction would be its taxable consumption, which would be taxed at a series of progressively higher percentages as consumption rose, so that it would be a progressive consumption tax, having that necessary element for any national tax system. Taxing consumption instead of income, taxing the stuff that we're trying to discourage instead of the stuff that we are trying to encourage, would boost productivity and investments and incentive to work hard. It would steer people towards smaller ecological footprints while not reducing in any sense their sense of freedom and well-being. This one, unfortunately, I can't steer you to any legislature to go and get your people to support it. Nobody wants to do this, though I am trying to build a system in Washington state that may be supportive of it if a ballot initiative to enact a progressive income tax goes down in flames, as I suspect it may. Next, reproduce within the planet's carrying capacity. This can be a 2-hour thing by itself, but I'll hit it hard. If there's any single lesson from the science of ecology, it has to be understood by the next generation of leaders. It is the huge margin by which Homo sapiens is currently overshooting the long-term carrying capacity of the planet. Poorest parts of Earth are showing signs of collapse already. UN demographers have discovered, to their horror, that sub-Saharan Africa is the first place in the world that, as life expectancies have been growing around the planet, there it has begun to shrink again. It finally hit a height once of about 60 years. It's now down to about 47 years on average for a person born in sub-Saharan Africa. Lots of contributors to that, including war and AIDS and what have you. A huge fraction of them. Starvation, desertification, waterborne diseases, and other things are part of the same ecological bubble that I was talking about, all of which will likely be compounded by climate change. If our goal were to have every person on Earth live at the level of material comfort of, say, the average Swede, the long-term carrying capacity of the planet, for the best analysis that we're able to do, probably the tightest on this was one done at Stanford, it seems to be about 2 billion people. We are currently 6.5 billion people on our way almost inevitably to 9 billion if the optimists are right. And just because of the age stratification of the population and women entering into childbearing years. The only way you can go there for the long term is to have people who are nowhere near the Swedish average. My favorite question, I asked it again this afternoon. Nobody got it. Nobody ever gets it. Where is the worst air pollution in the world? Mexico City. Guangzhou. Or Beijing. What have you. Yeah, it's a trick question, which is why nobody ever gets it. It's in a hut. Probably a hut out in maybe Western China, like the one that I was in about 2 months ago, that doesn't have a chimney. It doesn't even have a hole cut in the roof. And they, for warmth, burn dried dung. It has no windows. There's only a door. And you go in there on a cold day, and they close the door behind you, and you're surrounded by dung smoke. And God, in 2 hours, I felt at least a year slip away from my life expectancy. This just, went there from Beijing. There's no comparison. That isn't poverty as we think of it in the United States. That's a level of being destitute that hundreds of millions of people experience around the world, which is what lets the population be so big. If as most of the articles that discuss population on the basis of how many people can we feed, is it that the highest aspiration we can have is to feed as many people as we can possibly feed. If we're all, in essence, willing to live like Chinese peasants, probably the carrying capacity is up on the order of maybe 25 billion, more. But even Chinese peasants are not prepared to live like Chinese peasants. They're going in a mass migration into the cities. So transformation is taking place. And as they move higher on the economic ladder, the footprint gets bigger, and suddenly you find yourself with one more dimension heading off toward this. In that kind of a context, zero population growth ceases to be a radical aspiration. You know, zero population growth changed their name to something I can never remember, called Population and Resources, Inc. or something, because it was considered to be too radical. I think zero population growth is a really inadequate aspiration. We need to figure out how to persuade people to have one child and one grandchild and on through the lot until we get ourselves, and by ourselves I mean humanity, into the right range. I don't have any clever ideas about that at all. We've tried so many things, and a combination of religion, racial issues, identity politics, all kinds of things, even, interestingly, feminism. A woman's right to choose is the right to choose to have a child, not just a right to choose not to have a child. I was on the US delegation to the United Nations Population Conference in Cairo, and all sorts of wonderful stories to tell about the level of security once two radical groups had vowed jihad on us because it was in violation of their concept of what was appropriate under their religion. The Vatican, as some of you know, is a nation, 500 priests, it's a country. And so it has the same ability to attend these conferences as any other nation, and it went there explicitly to kill this thing with allies from Malta and one of the South American countries. I'm thinking it was Peru. And then they made common cause with folks from the Middle East and did their bit. But overwhelmingly, what we did was pass something that was terrific. It was strong commitments by developed countries to be putting resources into helping women around the world, because that's really the answer to this, giving women an option to get status and security in their old age from something other than a very big family. And so if you are doing things to give them education, you're doing things to give them an opportunity for employment, you're doing things to tie them into the broader world culture through internet access and things, you're doing all sorts of things that simply elevate them. You're loaning them money with these microlenders. All of that stuff was tied up in the package. It was, in my view, the best environmental initiative that came out of the 8 years of the Clinton-Gore administration. And it finished about 2 months before the November elections in 1994, at which time Jesse Helms became the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. How much of this did we actually implement? Not a phrase. I mean, it just down the toilet. There are those kinds of things that in theory can be done. We're running out of time on that as well. Just because it's a captive audience and because this is kind of a stunning thing, and it's big enough. There have to be Catholics out there. I'm going to be in trouble, but I'm going to say it anyway. So the apostolic eminence plenipotentiary or something, but other people sent ambassadors, but that was the Vatican's guy to this thing, was running around twisting arms trying to get people to vote against this final initiative. And there were all sorts of fascinating arguments, but my very favorite from it was a couple of people, must have been lawyers, because they were asking them all of these hypothetical questions about what would you do if this, and how's your, and finally pushing it further and further and further to find out where this guy's line would ultimately be drawn. They gave him the hypothetical that, okay, we have two people who are Catholic. They are well into their 60s. The woman cannot have any more babies. The husband has hemophilia, and before they knew about this, he, in a blood transfusion, acquired HIV, and he now has active AIDS. These two are deeply in love. They would like to manifest that love in an act of physical intimacy. What happens to the man if he wears a condom? And without a moment's hesitation, this fellow says, he would go to hell. It's just, and I don't know how you overcome that kind of thing. It's kind of interesting that the lowest birth rates in the world are in places like Italy. I mean, obviously, there are some people that are not paying a lot of attention to this. But you can find that same sort of thing in a great many faiths. You find battling things with various kinds of groups in an identity politics democracy where votes count to try to push. I mean, we're heading rapidly in terms of immigration policy and comparative birth rates into a nation that will relatively swiftly have a very different racial configuration than it does today. And to the extent you vote on blocks, that has frightening implications for others. I have been in rooms with very distinguished, thoughtful scientists who were pushing me aggressively to have more children than my one child because I owed it to my race, of all things. They're just appalled. And yet, it's getting to be commonplace out there. And this is one that obviously has me pretty deeply disturbed. No idea how to get there. Next, we need to temper extremes of wealth and poverty. Shortly after Jared Diamond published Collapse, I had the good fortune to have dinner with him, and I asked him whether in researching his book and just thinking about it, he'd recognized some common human behavior that if we could avoid it would dramatically boost the likelihood of avoiding future collapses. What is it? Is there a magic bullet out there that we ought to be addressing? And he said that collapses most commonly occur when the rich and powerful, when the people who run the society can shield themselves from the consequences of their decisions. I remember this exchange when I read that Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz had estimated that the 2008 economic crisis had driven more than 200 million people who'd risen into the middle class back into abject poverty. 200 million more will lead lives characterized by starvation, wretched health, forfeited education, widespread violence, mounting death rates. And meanwhile, the CEOs of investment banks whose irresponsible actions caused more suffering and death than are caused by most war criminals cart their $100 billion bonuses to their gated communities with their private security forces and their private jets, utterly untouched by the worst consequences of the crisis that they precipitated. If Diamond is right, and he's a very smart guy who studied all of these things, that's not the hallmark of a system that is designed to avoid collapse. So what would make sense instead? The corporate responsibility community has a lengthy agenda. None of it's rocket science. Companies ought to have more outside directors than inside directors, more directors who are brought in from no connection to the corporation and whose employment and compensation are not determined by the CEO. Second, the board chair and the executive compensation committee should all be outside directors. If a company becomes too big to fail, it should either be broken apart with antitrust mechanisms or it should be regulated like a public utility. We can't get ourselves into this position where we again are doling out $50 billion to rescue an insurance company because we can't afford to live with its irresponsibility. Compensation should be informed by long-term performance, not by quarterly or annual profits. You do want to align the executives' incentives with the company's incentives, but not with its quarterly incentives, with building something that's going to endure. More radically, but precisely on point, I think that the highest paid executive in any company should not earn more than 10 times as much as the lowest paid one. And to stop this from becoming every audience always has the lowest paid ones somewhere in it. And to stop this from becoming just another driver to outsourcing to overseas contractors, you should have, I think, some ratio, maybe 50-to-1, to apply to the employees of major subcontractors. I think that unless we rein in this gigantic and growing gap that we're getting between those who are becoming billionaires and those that are not, America appears to be well on its way toward developing a landed aristocracy. And with no limits on personal campaign expenditures by candidates, I think it's possible that the Senate could become effectively a House of Lords. That unless you were personally incredibly wealthy, you can't get in. It's already called the rich man's club. There are some notable exceptions, but it's getting harder and harder. New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg spent $108 million of his own money to win his third term. He's a pretty good mayor. I've got nothing against Bloomberg. He's actually bright, but $108 million, more than 10 times as much as his opponent. And his opponent spent less than 1/10 as much, relying entirely on donations and some public matching expenditures. The spending did not have any adverse effect upon Bloomberg's lifestyle. He's worth $17 billion. That is a drift that I think is terrifying in a democracy. Green jobs. Another important thing is, I think, to reframe the concept of green jobs. What it means today in most people's minds are electricians who now install solar panels, plumbers who now hook up solar water heaters. I think it has to include craftsmen who take pride in their work and take the time to build things that are more expensive to acquire and that are going to last for centuries. Society would have less income in any given year, but far more accumulated wealth over time. We would all be better off. And every study of human happiness that I've ever seen says that this would produce far more of it. As we move into new technologies, much make work will simply disappear, and LED will outlast by up to 80 times an incandescent lamp. That means that somebody no longer needs to change a lamp 79 times. That's a job. One thing that should flow from this, in my view, is shorter work weeks with the labor requirements spread over more of the population. It is not one of the most fulfilling jobs in the world to replace incandescent light bulbs. We ought to be doing things that eliminate the stuff that is essentially make work to the extent that technology can supplant it. But we can't use that to throw a huge fraction of the population into unemployment. So you have to have these other mechanisms, and so on. People are a lot smarter than I am, can develop a panoply of economic solutions to these sustainability issues. But I think the time is running out. So what does all of this mean for the people in this room? And here I'm thinking primarily of the students, though also people in the community. Politically, it means get engaged. Don't just hit the button to sign the petitions that are circulated rather, by the listservs that you're on. I probably get 10 of those a day. I probably click 3 of them. It adds up. It goes to some member of Congress someplace, and they sort of tabulate this, but it's not very transformational. Get involved in some way that people will pay attention to. Master some issue. Become an expert on something that is of importance, either to your local city council or to your state representative or to Peter DeFazio. God knows he's a really hardworking guy, but he can't know everything in the world, but he's responsible for everything in the world. Pick up a corner that you care about. Send him a 2-page, deeply researched, carefully thought about, and beautifully written. Emphasize, beautifully written. God, the writing of most of these things just sucks. But you can do it. Put it together in a way that will pull him into it. First one, you're not going to hear any response. But the second, third, fourth, somewhere along the line, the relevant staff person is going to say, you got this guy out there that really seems to know a lot about this fill in the blank issue. You got to read this. And pretty soon, you're going to be getting a call from their office asking you to talk about this the next time the congressman is in town. And use that. Get the leverage off of it. And there's nothing magical about the federal level. Eugene is a fabulous place. It should be the greenest city in the world. You've got the opportunity to do that here. I went on the web last night and found that there are 140,000 people in Eugene. That suggests that there's something like 80,000 adults. If you're like most of America, that means that about 1/3 of those will vote. The university has 22,000 students. It doesn't take a degree in mathematics to see some opportunities there. Do it. Do what Madison, Wisconsin did when it tried to transform itself. There are a great many college communities that become the leadership vehicles for things that should be happening around the world. There are an awful lot of towns the size of Eugene. Build them the best possible model. And build it the best and greenest university as well. Wonderful architectural staff and land use planning staff and materials staff, everything here to make this university the one that everybody looks to as a model. You can get it done. This is a state that counts. You have a governor who is an environmentalist. Your next governor is likely to be a more distinguished and nationally recognized one. Do things that are bold and that will capture attention and that are right. And even if occasionally they don't work, that's how we make progress. You try stuff that seems like it's right. Individually, at a personal level, I have 2 suggestions. First, think carefully about what's really important to you. Again, this is for the students. If you think about what's really important, and not just the first thing that comes to your mind like a Porsche Carrera, but the stuff that is really important to you, you may surprise yourself. I sat down and jotted down a list of what's important to me. To experience and appreciate beauty, to laugh often and hard, to win the respect of intelligent people, the affection of children, dogs, to live a life that reflects my values. In my case, that one has real costs, but integrity is priceless. To find work that causes me to spring out of bed every morning, eager to embrace the day. To achieve some concrete goals every year and other concrete goals every decade. Goals, somebody said, are dreams with deadlines. That's a nice concept. And to pass on to my only child and my only grandchild, not just my genes, but some of my values. It's probably the closest thing to immortality that any of us can really hope for. You should decide what's important to you, what's really important, and pursue it relentlessly. as a lodestone, sort of a guide to life. After hearing a talk that was 50% relatively depressing, I think the most upbeat thing that I can close with is this, that every species out there is driven by a survival instinct. In the end, when push comes to shove, they do what is going to get themselves ahead individually. But if that's challenging the long-term viability of the species, they tend to do things that are sacrificial and that will increase the probability of their species enduring. We're part of that great web. I've got some level of confidence in my heart that we have those same gut instincts to do the things that are in our interest to survive. So when you find yourself in adulthood faced with tough decisions, and you're going to find it day after day, there are things that come along that some of them are really minor, some of them are really major. Maybe deciding to quit your job over something that you just can't be associated with. Really tough things. You got a wife, a kid, what have you. I think the thing to do is to think about these broad issues. Think about the vast, incredible web of life that permeates the planet, and the miraculous way that it all ties together, the extraordinary beauty of the things that humans have created and that nature has created. Think about butterflies with brains that are so small you can barely detect them that somehow manage to leave Alaska and fly all the way down to Baja, California, navigating their way to the same resting stops along the way and turn around and fly back. The astonishment of that. Think about the elegiac songs of the humpback whales. Think about all of these things. For me, it's think about the coastal redwoods in Northern California. It appears that one of the offshoots of climate change, if you look over the last 100 years, is that in a jagged way, it's like everything out there. It looks like a random pattern until you map it over a long period of time, but it looks like the fog that comes into the coastal redwoods is diminishing fairly consistently now for a century. They get 30 to 40% of their water from the fog. That, for me, is my deepest religious experience, is out among the coastal redwoods, and it's incredibly painful to think that stuff that we're doing might be killing these things that have endured for 2,500 years. So think about the redwoods. Think about whatever is important to you. And then look into your soul. Ask that simple question. What's the right thing to do? And then standing atop the great University of Oregon-led corporation that advertises this powerful statement, just do it. Thank you.
Mr. Hayes, hello. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. You said all the things I'm always wishing more people would say. I'd love to clone an army of you and release you out into the world. Sir, I wonder if you can talk about the psychological state of the people who have their hands on the levers of power in the world. I would generally imagine a PhD economist is a pretty smart person, but we look at their behavior insisting that market forces be allowed to decide everything, while meanwhile externalizing all the true costs. And I think it's not difficult to say that these guys are clinically, diagnosably delusional. They're insane and they're running the world. So please talk about the psychological state of these people.
That's a tough one because I'm pretty hard on economists myself. There is this new evolving, economics is constantly mutating. Am I still broadcasting? I am. It's constantly mutating. We've had this brand new wave of behavioral economics, which is finally, after a long time, recognizing that people are not always rational beings, and there are various kinds of other things at play. Ecological economics is a thing that is now picking up more and more momentum in various parts of the country. It's been around for a long time. Herman Daly wrote Steady State Economy back in 71 or 72. Here we're talking about a guy who is incredibly bright, wrote a brilliant book, and it has never been reviewed in a peer-reviewed economics journal, but it has influenced a whole generation of people that came behind him. Former serious economist at the World Bank is now a professor at the University of Maryland. It's beginning to mutate. It is so clear to the rest of us that I'm pretty sure they will eventually carry on. Clearly, some economists have the ear of the president with regard to the financial crisis. That's their area of expertise. In years past, including up through the Clinton administration, through their control of OMB, they actually had a very big bunch of turf under them. That's kind of disappearing. And now we're seeing pretty assertive cabinet ministers that are doing this, and I don't think it's, public policy now has a whole lot of dimensions to it besides the economic dimension. They're players, but I don't think they're running the world anymore, or at least this country. Yeah.
A couple decades ago, M. King Hubbard, who came up with the theory of peak oil and how it will play out, he said we had to get beyond debt-based money in order to have a steady-state economy that respected the limits of the earth. And it's remarkable how you can't get either political party to talk about the limits to growth. They seem to assume that the earth is constantly getting bigger, like the expanding universe theory. The earth is round and finite, and the economic crisis is we reach the limits to growth. And just, if you could comment on that, and one quibble. I don't consider our governor or our congressman to be ecological, since they're pushing countless highways and clear cuts.
I never should comment on anybody in any state that I'm not a resident of. He has a greenish hue when viewed from the north. And one that I do know actually fairly well in the case of John Kitzhaber, I'm pretty confident if he's elected, he's going to be an extraordinarily good governor. The neat thing is he doesn't want to be governor. With regard to the people who are running the world, logically, there's this crazy thing that goes on. I think it picks up in grade school. Somebody has, I really, really, really want to be president. I really want to be governor. I really want, but they don't really have an agenda. They don't have a set of accomplishments. I mean, Bill Clinton has wanted to be president since he was in grade school, and he got it. But boy, 8 years of treading water at best. Kitzhaber has been governor. Doesn't get any additional points in any chart for doing it. I think he's really coming in a very bold way. He's going to say things that I think will irritate or somehow that every one of you will disagree with along with this campaign, but he's trying to elect an agenda. He's trying to get himself into office with a mandate to get some things done that he's going to be able to pull on in ways that were difficult for him last time. The broad point, Oregon counts. Oregon counts more than most states on environmental things, and so what you do here matters is one that I will stand on firmly.
Well, I'm from California. I've been here about 20 years. I love Oregon. But California's really been doing a lot of things that we need to do. And I want your opinion about emission fees. They have emission fees and emission taxes. And why is that so different from a carbon tax? To me, it seems like they could be related. But I know the Wall Street wants the cap and trade. And I don't know if you read this book by James Hansen. I just happened to have it along with me. I was going to read it in a few minutes. But he believes also against cap and trade and believes in having, have you read this book at all, James Hansen's book?
Yes, I have.
You have. Wonderful book. But he believes also in cap and dividend. And what do you say to that? And what do you say to emission fees? Why would that differ from having, just calling an emission tax or where they have it? I don't know, all over the country they probably have emission fees or emission taxes.
No.
They don't?
Really
Just California?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm very pleased about that. I worked hard at that.
Okay. What I was putting on a pitch for here that I'm calling cap and auction, and then moving that into the Cantwell bill, that is cap and dividend. I hope
It's
there's
the
no
same thing?
confusion. I am I'm strongly against cap and trade. I wanted to take the
Me
cap
too.
from the cap and trade. What he emphasizes is what you do with the revenue after you get it.
Yes, sounds
What I
great.
emphasize is how you get the revenue. But we're talking about the same thing. Hansen, I think, is on the money.
Except the dividend goes back to everyone in the country.
Yeah.
Hansen has. Is that what you're thinking too?
I hope I wasn't that ambiguous. Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying.
Was it?
I would
Okay.
like to keep a little bit of it for some other purposes, including aggressively moving on some renewables
True.
and efficiencies and high-speed electrified rail. But this is going to be a very big source of income, and it's going to be driving fossil fuels down in a way that makes everything else competitive with it, and returning that money to the consumers, but giving them a menu that has a different set of prices on it because carbon is more expensive is the way a free market ought to operate. The difference between that, and this is insider baseball for a lot of people, and we shouldn't spend too much time on it. With emissions fees, the difficulty is that emissions come from a huge number, I mean, hundreds of millions of sources, many of them very small. We have a focus in this country mostly upon very big things. So with the Clean Water Act, if it's a municipal sewage treatment facility, if it's a major factory, we control it. We don't do very well with regard to non-source emission, and yet those have now gotten to be so very big that they are the primary sources of contaminants now of rivers, and it's just not covered with any of these other things. I mean, when we focused on the Exxon Valdez, the EPA did this wonderful analysis that showed that the same year that the Exxon Valdez poured that oil offshore in Alaska, Americans who changed their own motor oil and poured the used motor oil down a storm sewer poured into our rivers and wetlands 12 times as much oil as was discharged by the Exxon Valdez. For emissions, if you're going after coal-fired power plants, if you're going after cement factories, very good process. You're going after tailpipes, you just can't do it. So what happens if you go with an upstream cap and auction? You get the carbon wherever it enters the economy. There are about 2,000 places where pipelines come into the United States, pipelines leave inside the United States natural gas fields, oil comes into the country, coal leaves the mine mouth. About 2,000 places, all of which already have federal regulation. We'd simply say per unit of carbon that comes out of that, it has to have a permit or it can't enter the economy. So you have to buy a permit to have it. And if you can't bring the carbon into the economy, it can't get to the emissions stack. We're just doing it comprehensively so that we get all the small ones as well as the big ones. Hansen, you get into the details, Hansen's exactly the same place that I am.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. It seems that most of your solutions consist of policy changes at the national level or global initiatives, and I'm just wondering what role you see for local self-sufficiency or bioregionalism in the pursuit of human permanence.
As much as we can get. In my ideal world, occasionally, I think that a president, much of whom's work I really cherish, Jefferson, made the tragic decision to have the Louisiana Purchase. We just got too damn big. And we're incredibly diverse, but I think much as the Soviet Union fragmented, there is a case to be made for America to fragment. And if we're going to do that, Cascadia is not a bad place to live in. I mean, this becomes a great model. Doing that, other than through armed insurrection, which I think is not a very good strategy, there are not other ways to accomplish it very well. And we have all of these, you have a constitutional right to travel. You can't have any kind of restriction on interstate trade. A variety of things have to be controlled by the federal government because they preempt the states under the Constitution, and on and on and on. But no, the closer you can get any decision to the people who are most impacted by it, by and large, the better the decision is. So I'm for pushing as much down as you possibly can.
Thank you.
5 more minutes or so?
Sure.
Okay.
Hi, Dennis. Thanks for coming. Really glad you're here. I was the science advisor for 2/3 of the churches in Oregon on global warming, and I ran the environmental education programs in several national parks and on Mount Hood at Timberline Lodge. My core question for you, for me, is mental health aspects of ecological renewal and the renewal of civilization. I think that's core. How do we come up with changes of heart that are helpful? People and civilizations respond to crises in different ways. Some deny it, some gum up the works. I think a small minority say, how can we be helpful? How can I be helpful? I look at the temper tantrums that some countries, some maybe fundamentalist societies of different kinds create, and I say, who really is becoming more altruistic? Challenges. Over half the people in the world now live in cities over 500,000 people. To me, one of the results of that is a lot of people are going to be disconnected from nature unless they garden or get out of nature. And then also, on a deeper level, this is a difficult question, but I'm in federal court suing the Forest Service. I'm not an attorney. I won my appeal against the chief federal judge here. I'm showing that the Forest Service has stolen $2.5 trillion of timber from itself. I was a core witness to the shutdown of a multi-$100 billion timber theft investigation. There are things that deep structure our society that we have to look at, and if we don't do that, we won't see the undertows that we're dealing with. So the question is about, as I said at the beginning, how do we enhance our mental health as we deal with increasing level of crises and challenges as individuals and as cultures?
Well, if I can pull something that is wise out about that. I think it's a really important issue. And a lot of it does come from this disconnect from nature that we've said. We all, as a species, evolved with a lot of things around us that you need to, in much of America, much of the world, travel great distances now to experience. And again, once it's linked to population, there is no way to cope with our numbers except through urbanization. But once you've got that level of urbanization, it's really difficult to get out there with the coastal redwoods. There are a number of programs that have been put together. What is it? The Last Child in the Woods or something like that is the fellow who wrote a book that is now being spread through a bunch of educational systems to get people out. We have a number of things up in the Seattle area. I'd be shocked if you don't hear as well, to get kids out into nature for a couple of weeks here and there. And a whole bunch of programs for volunteers in the summer to go out, including people who've gone out and become park rangers who came out of really depressed communities. But to spread that across society, no, it's a huge, difficult challenge, and I've now mumbled long enough, and I haven't found any wisdom, so I'll probably wrap it up. Sorry.
Yes, I'm concerned about the national hysteria about burning biomass trees to produce electricity, and we're even going to be exporting trees from this country to England for providing electricity for 200,000 homes in one plant. In Eugene, we have the Seneca Sustainable Energy LLC is going to be burning the refuse, supposedly, and then using some of their trees. I'm wondering what you think about this national hysteria, because all of our congressmen and legislators and our EWEB commissioners pretty much have gone for that. And second, would you say a few words about your green products program?
Biomass has a lot of desirable attributes. It has a few undesirable attributes, including the very low efficiency of photosynthesis compared to other ways to capture sunlight. But one of the big things is that storage is a natural part of it. If you cart it off into a power plant, you don't take much advantage of that attribute. If you've got chemical energy stored with no cost in a liquid fuel constrained world, you probably ought to be using it for things like transportation, not for electricity, which we can get from a wide variety of other sources. That's not to say that I would put an iron line that no cellulose should ever be burned in a power plant, but on balance, I'd put it elsewhere. Candidly, I think that over a period of time measurable in decades, not centuries, biomass is not going to be one of the most important fuels in the future unless we can figure out a way to make microalgae work much better than they currently do. And the problems in that are significant. It's one of those technologies, a bundle of those technologies, where the longer a person has been working in the field.
You're not quite reaching the back of the room. Would you mind taking this? That's okay.
I'm not sure I can work with two of them. Oh, they turned it off. Okay. Did anybody hear what I said?
Yeah.
Getting to the chase. photosynthesis captures sunlight relatively inefficiently and puts it into a series of hydrogen-carbon bonds. They can be hydrocarbons, they can be carbohydrates, they can be what have you. But it's stored there, and it will remain there for a very long period of time, even geological periods of time. If you're going to be using that for fuel, you want to take advantage of that built-in storage, and that's probably not best used making electricity, in my view. An interesting factoid with regard to my engagement with this area that may have left me soured about the whole field and distorted my views. In the late 1970s, in conversations with a couple of farm implement manufacturers and a couple of grain companies, I was part of a team that agreed to move into converting corn into alcohol as a transitional strategy toward cellulosic-based ethanol. And that was, once again, taking advantage of the stored energy in a liquid fuel that you could use then, either as ethanol or methanol to, say, run automobiles, or in that particular case, to run farm machinery. It was a transitional thing. We thought we were moving into cellulosic ethanol in maybe 82, 83, 84. Unfortunately, the budgets were zeroed out in 80, but that was the objective. Meanwhile, the corn ethanol grew and grew and grew. Anybody that wants to be president wants to win the Iowa caucuses. Don't do that by being anti-corn ethanol. And last year, the amount of grain in the United States that was converted into fuel ethanol was more grain than the total grown in Canada, plus the total grown in Australia, plus the total grown in Argentina. It is just a gigantic number. And in a population-constrained world where a lot of good things can be done with that corn directly and indirectly through animals, it's just the stupidest policy possible. And so in this context, I really split with a whole bunch of my brethren. I think that was crazy to get into. I was part of the mistake. I trusted things. And as soon as the cellulosic program got shut down, I think we should have shut down the corn program. Obviously, I'm never going to be president.
I have a question kind of following on the same subject, because I do like your proposal about the cap and auction and the dividend distribution, but when you mentioned how to assess the tax upstream, you seem to refer just to fossil fuels. The problem that we have here in this area with the biomass is that we have something that is not a fossil fuel, but the carbon impacts of obtaining the biomass, like getting a slash out of the forest when it's been clear cut and the fertility of the forest disappears, all this releases carbon. Would we be able to have a carbon revenue system that is also able to recognize a fallacy in something that apparently seems sustainable? I mean, yes, it's better to have liquid fuel from a plant, but if we, is there a way to present a credible analysis of what's going on in the soil? What does it take to get that supposedly renewable and sustainable, so we can decide which of these renewable energies are really significantly better and which are just as bad as fossil fuel? And then work that into the revenue system that is seeming to gain some recognition.
I'll go with a strong maybe. All of the points that you raise are right. And the impact on soil carbon, the impact on soil fertility, the impact on erosion, what have you. As I said during the time when nobody could hear me, but I thought I was speaking, I suspect that in the long term, anything that we're getting from biomass in large amounts is probably going to be from microalgae, and the next largest is almost certainly going to be from waste. And I'm not talking about salvage stuff out in the forest. I'm talking about construction wastes and newspaper after it's been recycled 5 or 6 times, and on and on. So a system that tries to incorporate biological sources in the same basic structure as it's dealing with fossil sources raises just a myriad of complexities that you avoid by going with fossils. It also leaves a problem unsolved. But I guess I would like intuitively to have 2 systems, one that deals with biological sources, another that deals with fossil sources, which have so very many differences. And this is really insider baseball, but suffice it to say, The trade part of cap and trade involves a series of offsets where there are things happening biologically that have all kinds of desirable aspects to them, but in order to get them done, you let people burn more and more coal. And anything that intermingles biological sources with other sources will have such extraordinary political pressures on it that I'm afraid it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to keep the trade aspects out. If you got the trade aspects in, I think it becomes almost a worthless policy. But your points are all valid, and we've got to find some way to address them.
We'll be able to take only one more question. Apologies to those of you who will be left at the mic. Sarah, we can't see you.
I just wanted to ask, whenever you hear about alternative energy sources like wind and solar, you always hear clean and renewable, but I was curious about with all the raw materials it would take to build and maintain a alternative energy structure and infrastructure, if it's really realistic to believe that we could build and sustain an alternative energy system.
Sure, a very legitimate question. How much energy goes into getting the system? How much material goes into getting it? Is this really something that's plausible, or is this always going to be something that heats a little bit of bath water and gives us symbolic electricity in specific applications? If you crunch the numbers, and it is too late for me to be allowed to march through the chain of logic here tonight, but I will just take a leap to the conclusion. We don't have a way to take care of the legitimate energy needs of a robust human population in the long term without a massive application of solar technology. Wind has a role to play, I think, but my guess is it's going to be relatively transitional. Wind resources are a trivial fraction of solar resources, and what's going to happen are a whole series of technology advances. We are going to be having, I would bet my house on, very thin films, and we're talking now a few tens of nanometers thick, that are going to be relatively efficient. I'm hoping it's going to be 25, 30%, taking advantages of some of the kinds of structural things they can do now in nanotechnology. And you can stretch that material, which I think you can do without using any rare earths or other really, really expensive things, so much that, you know, at those kinds of thicknesses, you basically begin to coat the built environment the same way that photosynthetic operations coat the natural environment. I mean, we were talking over dinner about the eruption of Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens left behind a wasteland. Then over time, you began to see a little bit of moss coming up, and the moss sort of turned into topsoil, and you saw some ferns sprouting on it. You go much of it now, it's got trees. It's gotten past saplings, and some things are really coming up. And it will, unless there's another eruption, in another 20 years, it will be pretty green. Not as green as it was when I went there as a teenager, but really pretty lovely. We're going to be doing that same sort of thing with photovoltaics that will be dramatically more efficient than the photosynthesis, which typically is maybe 0.5% efficient, versus the most efficient single crystalline solar cells now are like 23%, unless you get the super efficient ones for space applications, but they're breathtakingly expensive. They're up over 40. I mean, that's where I think the energy is coming from, coupled with new super batteries, new ultracapacitors, all kinds of storage mechanisms. We could even use flywheels that are part of a pattern that is going on more and more and more that you may think of as the dematerialization of the world and of the economy. We're doing things using less and less and less stuff. Over lunch today, a fellow here from your green chemistry department was talking and gave me an article tonight that I'm going to be reading about a new material that is taking advantage of some unique structures in this engineered material that in a very, very, very thin thing gives you the insulation values of a very thick conventional insulation. To the extent you start doing that sort of stuff, you put a solar wall onto a building and you've got this super insulation behind it, you've got something that you could coat a city with a few pounds of things, harness all of the energy, reduce the energy use inside the dwellings, and have all sorts of stuff that comes out of it. So that's a long way of saying yes. not only can it make a meaningful contribution, it's going to make, in my view, I'm not sure in my lifetime, but in my daughter's lifetime, I think it's going to become the principal source of commercial energy on the planet. And there are all kinds of things that you will encounter. I might as well ramble for another minute or two just because these are the myths that are out there. In the early stages with photovoltaics, it took a lot of energy to refine the silicon, a lot of energy to, you lost a huge amount of the silicon in the cutting process to make the wafers. There were all kinds of things that gave you a feedback time, a payback time for the modules that were really pretty long. You put them up in Phoenix, Arizona, and it might take 12 years to generate as much power as went into creating the module. And if you're doing that, then it's pretty hard to grow very rapidly because it's a gigantic energy sink until it starts producing net energy. Now the payback periods for a lot of these things are on the order of 4 months, and for the thin films, they can be a month or two, and it's getting lower and lower as it's getting dematerialized. So that issue is completely dead with a wooden stake driven through its heart. You'll still hear it pumped up, but it's wrong. The costs are becoming more and more effective, not because of anything that we did, but because of the things the Germans did and the Spaniards did, the Dutch did, the Japanese did, now that the Koreans and Chinese are doing. This is coming in a way that is now, I think, unstoppable. We're going to have interests in this country that are going to be trying to stop it, but they can't stop it because it's a global phenomenon. We started it, then we shut down our efforts in 1980, and now we're trying to get back in the game because the rest of the globe has made it happen. Enough. Thank you.